Have you ever had a teacher so terrible that you actually wondered, how are they still allowed to teach? Some teachers are strict, some are tough, but then there are the ones that cross the line into absolute nightmare territory. Today, we're diving into the world of teachers who never should have stepped foot in a classroom. From those who abuse their authority in the most ridiculous ways, to teachers who go out of their way to humiliate students in front of the entire school. These stories will make you question everything. Ever had a teacher who twisted a student's ear so hard it bled? Or one who blamed a student for their own fart just to avoid embarrassment? These aren't just wild exaggerations. These things actually happened. So, buckle up and get ready, because these are some of the worst teachers ever. And before we jump in, don't forget to subscribe to Reddit True Vault for more unbelievable Reddit stories. Trust me, after hearing these, you'll be grateful for every decent teacher you ever had. Now, let's start with a teacher who wasn't just strict, she was downright abusive. Story 1. The cruel teacher, beating a student until they bled. When I was in middle school, I had a teacher named Miss Patterson, and to this day, I still can't believe she was ever allowed near children. She wasn't just strict, she was outright cruel. Every little mistake earned you a punishment. Talking in class, she'd slam her wooden ruler against the desk. Forget your homework? She'd make you stand at the front while she scolded you in front of everyone. But the worst part? She wasn't afraid to use force. One day, my classmate Ethan forgot his notebook. That was it, just a simple mistake. Miss Patterson's face twisted with rage, and before anyone could react, she brought down her ruler onto his arm hard. The loud smack echoed through the room. Ethan flinched, holding his arm, his face going pale. But she wasn't done. Realizing she didn't have her ruler the next time, she grabbed him by the ear instead. She twisted so hard that the skin tore, leaving a small but visible cut. Blood dripped down his neck, and that's when the entire class froze. Ethan's parents were furious. They stormed into the principal's office the next day, demanding answers. Miss Patterson was fired on the spot, but you know what? To this day, I still don't understand how she wasn't arrested. Story 2. The teacher who blamed her own fart on a student. I had my fair share of strict teachers growing up, but Miss Thompson? She was something else. She had this weird obsession with punishing students over the tiniest things, sneezing too loudly, dropping a pencil, even just looking distracted. But nothing topped what happened in 7th grade. One day, we were all sitting in class, completely silent, absorbed in our reading assignment. Out of nowhere, the loudest fart I had ever heard ripped through the room. It was undeniable. It echoed off the walls. A split second of stunned silence followed. Then the entire class erupted into laughter. Miss Thompson's face turned red, not from embarrassment, but from rage. She scanned the room, and her eyes landed on my friend, Jake. With the most serious expression ever, she pointed at him and said, "Well, maybe you should have gone to the bathroom before farting in class." Jake's face went pale. "Wait, what? That wasn't me," he protested. But she wasn't having it. For talking back to an adult, she slapped him with 2 days of lunch detention. To this day, I swear, if there had been a camera in that classroom, Miss Thompson would have become an internet legend. Coming up next, story number 3, the witch who treated her students like trash. Looking back, I'm convinced Mrs. Holloway wasn't just a mean teacher, she was an actual witch. And I don't just mean her personality. She literally dressed as a witch every Halloween. I had her in 1st grade at a Catholic school, and from day one, she made it clear mistakes were unacceptable. If you so much as colored outside the lines, she'd make you feel like the biggest disappointment on earth. But one day, she took things to another level. My friend Josh had forgotten his pencil, so he whispered to me, asking to borrow one. Before I could even pass it to him, Mrs. Holloway's sharp voice cut through the room. "Josh, since you love borrowing so much, why don't you borrow some time in the trash can?" She actually made him stand inside the classroom garbage bin for the rest of the lesson. While the rest of us sat at our desks, he was stuck there, humiliated, balancing on top of crumpled paper and leftover lunch wrappers. I swear the worst part? Every year, without fail, she dressed as a witch for Halloween. Pointy hat, black cloak, the whole thing. At the time, I thought it was just a joke. But now? Yeah, I'm not so sure. Next up is story number 4. The nosy substitute who stuck her fingers in a student's mouth. When I think about the worst teacher I ever had, Mrs. Callahan immediately comes to mind. She wasn't even our real teacher, just a substitute. But the level of insanity she brought to our classroom? Unmatched. I was in 5th grade when this happened. That day, our usual teacher was out sick, so we got Mrs. Callahan, a substitute who acted like she was running a military camp. She was strict, easily irritated, and seemed to believe that every kid was secretly plotting against her. The breaking point came when my friend Melissa was sitting quietly at her desk. Out of nowhere, Mrs. Callahan stormed up to her, glaring down like she had just caught her committing a federal crime. "Are you chewing gum in my classroom?" she barked. Melissa, completely caught off guard, barely had time to shake her head before Mrs. Callahan did the unthinkable. She jammed her fingers into Melissa's mouth. The entire class froze. No one could believe what we were seeing. Melissa was so stunned she didn't even react, just sat there, wide-eyed, while this deranged woman dug around her mouth, physically searching for gum that wasn't even there. When she finally pulled her hand back, she scoffed, wiped her fingers on a tissue, and walked away like nothing had happened. Melissa? She just sat there in shock, probably trying to process how she had just been violated in broad daylight. Parents were furious when they found out. But when they reported it to the principal, he just shrugged it off with a lazy. She had the right to check if she suspected something. To this day, I still don't understand how that woman didn't get sued. Top of form, bottom of form. Up next, story number 5. Humiliated in front of the class. Over lice. When I was 6, my family moved around a lot because of my dad's job in the military. That meant I was always the new kid at school. Adjusting was already hard enough. But one teacher made sure my time there was a complete nightmare. One morning, I was sitting in class when my head started itching like crazy. I scratched it absent-mindedly, not thinking much of it. But then, out of nowhere, my teacher, Mrs. Caldwell, marched up to my desk and yanked me up by the arm. "Jake, come here," she snapped, dragging me to the front of the class. She then inspected my hair in front of everyone, as if I was some science experiment. Are we dealing with lice here?" she mused, way too loudly. The entire class gasped, and that was it. The damage was done. For the next 3 months, I wasn't Jake anymore. I was Bug Bite. Kids whispered behind my back, refused to share pencils with me, and acted like I was some kind of walking infestation. The worst part? I didn't even have lice. My head was just itchy from dry scalp. Thankfully, my family moved again, and I never saw Mrs. Caldwell or those kids again. But to this day, the word Bug Bite makes my skin crawl. Top of form, bottom of form. Now, here's story number 6. The teacher who didn't allow talking, but had no problem screaming. I've had my fair share of strict teachers, but Ms. Scally was on a completely different level. She wasn't just strict, she was a tyrant in a pencil skirt and a tight bun. Talking? Absolutely not. Asking to use the bathroom? Only if you enjoyed getting publicly humiliated. Needing clarification on an assignment? Better figure it out yourself. One day, during a particularly confusing lesson, I hesitated before raising my hand. I wasn't trying to be difficult. I just genuinely didn't understand what she had said. "Excuse me, Miss Scally, but could you?" Before I could even finish, she slammed her book shut and spun around so fast her heels nearly clicked together. Her face twisted in rage. "I already told you once. I do not repeat myself." The entire class fell dead silent. I shrank back in my seat, feeling my face heat up. Later that day, I realized I had left my book in the classroom. I went back after school to grab it, assuming it wouldn't be a big deal. I barely stepped 1 foot inside before I heard her bellow from across the room. "Get out of my classroom." I froze. Out. I didn't argue. I just turned and left. If she wanted to act like a crazed drill sergeant, that was her problem. To this day, I still don't understand why some people like that even become teachers. Coming up next, story number 7. The substitute teacher who shamed a sick kid. I've had some bad teachers in my life, but Mrs. Callahan was in a league of her own. She wasn't just strict, she was mean for the sake of being mean. One day, we had a substitute teacher for our English class. Everything was going fine until she suddenly turned her attention to Ben, a quiet kid who had type 1 diabetes. She narrowed her eyes at him as he pulled out a small juice box. "And what do you think you're doing?" Ben, clearly uncomfortable, held up his juice. My blood sugar's low." Mrs. Callahan scoffed. "Oh, please. You just want an excuse to sneak in a snack. You're not fooling anyone." The room fell silent. Did she seriously just accuse him of faking diabetes? Ben, now visibly shaken, stammered, "No, I really need to drink this." Or Mrs. Callahan rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic sigh. "Always the rebels, huh? Think you can just break the rules because of some made-up condition?" The tension in the room skyrocketed. Even the kids who usually didn't pay attention were glaring at her. Ben didn't say another word. He just drank his juice with a clenched jaw, too embarrassed to fight back. After class, some students told the principal, but nothing happened. To this day, I still don't understand how that woman ever got a job teaching kids. If she had an ounce of empathy, she must have left it at home. Up next, story number 8. The teacher who called students dumb and dumber. I thought high school would be tough, but nothing prepared me for Mr. Reynolds, our substitute teacher from hell. From the moment he walked into class, he had this smug, I don't care about any of you attitude. But things took a real turn when he locked onto Ethan and Evan, two twin brothers sitting near the front. He scanned them with a judgmental smirk and chuckled. Huh, you two must be fun at home. So which one of you is dumb, and which one's dumber? The class burst into laughter. Ethan and Evan? Not so much. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Mr. Reynolds wasn't done. Actually, he mused, stroking his chin like some wannabe philosopher. Maybe you're just dumb number 1 and dumb number 2. Yeah, that works. The twins looked at each other, mortified. You could tell they wanted to speak up, but when a teacher humiliates you like that, what are you supposed to do? And just like that, the nickname stuck for the rest of the class. Every time he called on them, it was, all right, dumb number 1, answer this, or dumb number 2, try not to embarrass yourself. By the end of the day, half the school was calling them that. But karma has a funny way of working. When Ethan and Evan told their parents, they went nuclear. The very next day, the principal dragged Mr. Reynolds out of class mid-lesson. He never came back. A year later, I was at a fast food joint when I heard a familiar, irritated voice at the register. Sir, do you want fries or not? I turned around and there he was, Mr. Reynolds, now wearing a name tag that said trainee. Dumb number 1 and dumb number 2 had the last laugh. Now, here's story number 9. The teacher who refused to teach. We had to teach ourselves. I've had my fair share of bad teachers, but Mr. Peter? He was on another level. He was supposed to be our math teacher, but honestly, he was more like a hallway ghost, physically present but completely checked out. Every day, he'd stroll into class, scribble a bunch of equations on the board without saying a word, and then plop down in his chair, glued to his phone. That was it. No explanations, no guidance, just problems we had to figure out ourselves. If anyone dared to ask for help, his response was always the same. You better learn how to figure things out on your own. No one's gonna hold your hand in the real world. One day, I finally snapped. I was struggling with a problem and raised my hand, hoping, just maybe, he'd do his job for once. Instead, he sighed, grabbed the heavy math textbook, and slammed it on my desk so hard that my pencil nearly jumped off. Read it. The answer's in there. I'm not your personal tutor, he barked. At that moment, I realized we were on our own. The entire class had been relying on each other to learn because our so-called teacher just couldn't be bothered. Eventually, parents started complaining, and after enough pressure, the school finally fired him. But here's the kicker. When we heard the news, he didn't seem angry or even surprised. He just shrugged, grabbed his stuff, and walked out. Honestly, I think he was relieved. Like, he never wanted to be there in the first place. Not every teacher is perfect, but the ones on this list? They were a complete nightmare. From unfair punishments to outright cruelty, these teachers took their power way too far, and their students never forgot it. But now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever had a teacher so bad they made you question reality? Maybe they were lazy, unfair, or just straight up evil. Tell us your worst teacher stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe to Reddit True Vault for more insane Reddit stories. We're just getting started, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.